Welcome to the Indie Pub, a laid-back interview show dedicated to the world of self and indie publishing. I'm your host, Jay Rushing, author of the self-published fantasy noir novel Radio, and a beverage buff with a passion for deep dives and good times. Every 2 weeks, a guest will step into the pub with a publishing-related topic and a favorite drink for us to explore and enjoy. Whether you want to sharpen your craft, snag a new cocktail recipe, or just have a laugh, there's always a seat and a full glass waiting for you at the Indie Pub. Welcome to episode 1 of the Indie Pub. Today's guest is K.M.Alexander, author of the new weird and cosmic horror series, The Belforging Cycle, currently including The Stars Were Right, Old Broken Road, and Red Litten World. He's here with us to discuss what it takes to adapt a pre-existing mythos into our own writing. But before we dive in, tell us a little bit about what we're drinking here in the pub today.
Well, thanks for bringing me on for episode 1.
Yeah, absolutely.
It is an honor, sir. Today, we are drinking a cocktail of our own concoction, mostly your concoction, but we worked on it together, so I'm going to throw myself in there as well. It's called the Pallid Mask, and the Pallid Mask is a cocktail. I basically pinged you, I want to say it was like late at night for you.
Yeah.
I was doing a reading for a King County, which is our local library system. I was doing an online reading during the pandemic, and they always suggest cocktails with each of the stories. And so I came to you and was like, hey, I want to come up with a cocktail, and I'm looking for these traits, and I wanted it kind of smoky and kind of herbally, and you started throwing things together. And so the Pallid Mask is named after obviously Chambers' King in Yellow, which was loosely connected to the story I was reading at the time. And it is 2 parts young mezcal. It is 1 part chartreuse, green, although I suppose you could use yellow. I have green, so that's what I'm using. And then 1 part vermouth, white vermouth. And I'm using Dolan, which is a good one. It's a solid vermouth for this. So yeah, that's what we're drinking here at the Indie Pub today. So nice. Yeah.
Well, cheers for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so now let's talk about Mythos.
Mythos, we can do that.
I know your series, The Belforging Cycle, draws heavily from Lovecraftian lore. So let's start there. So why Lovecraft?
Well, that's a really weird question because it has a really weird answer. It's one of those things that's it's not strictly just Lovecraft. Lovecraft is definitely a part, a big part of that. I think it's kind of that initial spark that I kind of took and ran in my own direction. I've jokingly called the series a dark cyberpunkish post-apocalyptic, dystopian, weird Western cosmic horror urban fantasy adventure. Just a really simple describer for the series. And
well, having read them, I can say that's very accurate.
Yeah, that's the most accurate I could possibly get while still being incredibly broad. So I like the ideas of cosmicism, which is kind of Lovecraft's idea of an uncaring universe full of things that will kill you, essentially. It's too large to comprehend. And I kind of took from that and then started going down the path. I actually didn't come to Lovecraft until I was an adult. So I don't have the kid, I don't a lot of people read Lovecraft when they're teenagers. And so they have that kind of childhood sort of nostalgia that comes from it. And I didn't really have that. I was in college when I started reading Lovecraft. So I was able to recognize some of the negative aspects of Lovecraft's writing right away, where I think as a kid you don't always pick up those sort of subtleties. So Lovecraft's xenophobia and his racism and stuff, which runs through the work, is still that I was able to recognize. So it was really easy to kind of glean that stuff away from anything that I was going to take. So it was mostly me focusing on more of the pantheon, for lack of a better word, of his kind of elder gods, or the great old ones, or things like that. And so that's really the main thing that I drew from. And then there's connections to some of his other work from like the Dream Cycle and some of the other stuff. But then I've also pulled from like William Hope Hodgson, Arthur Machen, and Dunsian stuff. And right now I've been really focused on Chambers, who did The King in Yellow. And really, you should just only read the rest of his stuff later on. It's not that great, but like The King in Yellow is a great book full of some really good stories. And then he just kind of shoot it in for the rest of his life, and it was like the rest of his work just it doesn't have the same bite as those kind of early stuff from Chambers. So it's like Lovecraft was the start, but like there's really a lot of writers that were all kind of writing that similar cosmicism, and so like I started pulling in stuff from all that sort of thing. So like Arthur Machen's Great God Pan, like Pan shows up in The Stars Were Right. Like that's a part of the overall story, and that was pulled from Arthur Machen, who, you know, Lovecraft even like referenced him as well. So there's a lot of that goes on within, I think, cosmic horror in general, and weird fiction is a lot of that kind of borrowing and writing and twisting and changing. And so there's a little, you know, it's an easy mythos to work with, and because it's already happening, right? So you don't feel like you're stepping on toes that much when you're kind of taking it in a different or new direction. So it's a really long-winded response to your question.
No, that's fine. That's totally fine. So kind of along those lines, what are some of the elements that you've purposefully changed? You mentioned, obviously, the xenophobia and racism were things you carved out right away. But what are some of the other things from those people's mythi? I'm not sure the plural. But what are some of the things that you chose to, you know, leave to them as opposed to utilize in your own work?
It's not for me, it wasn't a mental choice. Like I wasn't like, I'm not going to include this or I'm not going to include that. I think the mythos is broad enough that you just kind of take it and twist it in ways that works for whatever your story is. So, you know, for example, I don't really reference creatures, elder gods, you know, great old ones, that sort of thing, by name, like by Lovecraft's name. I've given them new names. I might describe them in similar ways, but you know, I'm kind of taking them I'm kind of building my own kind of pantheon as I write. So it's not really a direct, like, I don't want to include that or I don't want to include this. And I think too, because the mythos is made up of mostly short stories and I'm writing like longer form novels, there's just short stories I don't pay attention to, right? Like it's just, I don't include it. So it's like, it might be included in the big broad picture of mythos, capital M, but like I'm going to use whatever I feel like using and apply it in ways that I think works within the world of the bell forging cycle. And yeah, so.
Can you give a few examples of some of the things that you described as elements you use, but like names you've changed or details you've changed? Sure. Like I know in your stories you have multiple basically types of humanoids.
Yeah. And that actually, well, how about first of all, let me pitch the story. So
absolutely.
Yeah. So the bell forging cycle takes place in a world after the Lovecraftian elder gods have kind of shown up, wreck shop, changed everything, fundamentally changed the world, and then disappeared again, and for thousands of years, to the point that they become kind of myths and jokes for most people. But that those fundamental changes have, you know, profound impacts on humanity and on the world itself. So the world itself is similar, but not quite what we really recognize. And along with those changes are a whole new group of humanoids, aquatics, like species that live alongside humans, and they're definitely different species. And some of those are really subtle changes. Like there's a group of humanoids called Dominions, which kind of grow these bony spurs from various points of their bodies. There's another group called the Dogger, which wear metal masks, and no one really knows why, and they're always wearing metal masks. And then there's the Anner, which are kind of these like frog or fish-like people, or the Cephals, which are definitely like cephalopods, right? Like I didn't go very far with that name, but they're essentially like kind of like giant octopi that like interact with humanity on some level. So those are sort of things that are all kind of rooted within, for the most part, something of Lovecraft's work. So like there's like the deep ones, which are you find those in Shadows over Innsmouth, and they're kind of these like weird fish people, and Lovecraft referred to them as like servitor races a lot of times. Like they usually served, like, so for example, the Deep Ones worship Dagon, who's a fish god, and so it's like I was like, well, what happens if these are like in Lovecraft's work, they're always they're servitor races. They're like fodder in a lot of ways. They're just like, oh, here, they're going to go out there and be the foil for the hero, right? And I'm like, well,
red shirts of the horror world.
Yeah, exactly. And so it's like, I want to take those people and I want to make them people. Like they have hopes and dreams and lives. They're not just, these kind of mindless drones. Which there are mindless drones too in my work, but for the most part, I like trying to, for lack of a better word, humanize some of that aspect. So like taking some of that, and then in other cases, like I do a lot of like reference, not necessarily to like Nyarlathotep or like these like big names. Like they tend to show up in other places. So like I'll use a lot of the like Lovecraft's like maybe location names or some of the people within this story. So like I know that Mythos fans that have come to my work recognize that sort of stuff, but like you don't necessarily need it to like the story still stands on its own without it. So it's like that's really where a lot of that sort of stuff comes from. Plot wise, I go completely away from anything that's in Lovecraft. Like Lovecraft's plots are generally they're most of the time they're told via like letters to people, especially within like kind of the true Mythos work. You think of like Call of Cthulhu or Shadows over Innsmouth or Color Out of Space, like those sort of things are kind of like these like after reports kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So like I'm kind of going more with like the like urban fantasy route with like plots and stories and characters and things like that. I'm also kind of avoiding the, for lack of a better term, like the you can't win scenario, which is definitely a thing in Lovecraft's work. Like the heroes tend to lose or go insane. And I might be playing with some of that stuff, but like, the first few books, like there's achievement and victory and defeat, absolutely. Like that sort of thing. So I'm kind of avoiding some of that stuff as well.
So actually, this is a great time to bring up my next question. What do you think obviously there are similarities between a person adapting a mythos and then writing fan fiction. But what do you think are some of the key differences between those two pursuits?
I don't know if there's really that much. I think fan fiction tends to, and I'm trying to, I don't want to like put my foot in my mouth, but fan fiction tends to not be like it's writing towards just the thrill of writing characters that you love, and really just kind of like playing within someone else's space. Where I feel like adaptation is taking things in a different direction. It's moving away from whatever that core, like if I was to write Lovecraftian fan fiction, I suppose I would have characters from his stories doing things that the characters in the stories do, and they would kind of follow those same beats. And I don't do that. So I think that's kind of a big separation between those two things. But I think it's a fine line too, because like clearly fan fiction can become its own thing enough to a point where it gets kind of picked up and kind of goes in directions that can be successful for somebody and can be it can be a marketable book. So it's kind of a fuzzy line, I think. I don't think it's like I don't think it's like a hard, like you're writing fan fiction or you're adapting somebody's work. I think I'm far enough away from the Lovecraftian stuff, especially now. Like I'm definitely within the cosmic horror writing. Yeah. But I've kind of established my own universe at this point. Like it's pulled from the Lovecraftian stuff, but it's not just Lovecraftian stuff. And I feel like if you're gonna like let's just take a property like Star Trek, right? If I'm gonna write, like you could write kind of the themes of Star Trek with your own stories, and it would be its own kind of thing. But if you're gonna write Star Trek fan fiction, it's gonna be Captain Picard and Geordi hanging out and doing very particular Captain Picard and Geordi things, right? Like that's just what the nature of fan fiction, where I think when you start to move away from those beats, those story beats that were kind of common to the Next Generation, which is what I'm referencing, then like that's when you're starting to kind of telling your own thing, even if the characters might have the same name at that point. A lot of times, I think, when you know that you're not writing fan fiction is when you can change a character's name and it's like a whole different character, and you're not like, oh, that's, that's Captain Picard. They could become somebody else, right? And I think that's a difference with adaptation as well, as when it kind of becomes when it stands on its own without necessarily needing to know all these references to the property that you're working within.
Yeah, well, and going back to something you mentioned earlier, I sometimes wonder if it has to do with a kind of the depth of recognition. How much work are you needing to do to recognize where the influences are? Like you were saying that, fans of cosmic horror are going to recognize things within your books, but it's not specifically called out necessarily. And so I don't know, that seems to be basically one of the lines that I see drawn often.
Well, right. And like, it's one of those things that's like, if you get the reference, you might smile, but like, it's not going to like necessarily add or take away from the story. Just like, like you read radio, right? And like you make all these references to all these different pantheons and these different gods, essentially. And like, you don't necessarily need to know,
absolutely.
Like you don't need to know the whole backstory of Marduk, right? Like you can still enjoy the book without necessarily needing to be the number one Marduk super fan, right? And like I think that's I think a big difference with fan fiction is it tends to rely heavily on you having watched every episode of Supernatural, or you having, read all the Harry Potter books, or have, watched all the Deep Space Nine. Like there's like these things within fan fiction that I think kind of are reliant on you knowing all that stuff. And I think when you start to move away from that is when it's not necessary to know that stuff. You can still probably appreciate the story. There's good fan fiction out there, but without necessarily watching every episode of Supernatural. But I think you get more from the story if you do. Yeah. I don't necessarily know if knowing all of Lovecraft stuff is going to give you more from my story. It'll make you smile a few times. You might pick up in references and stuff, but like the books themselves are really kind of separate, or have moved away from that stuff pretty early on. They're also like, I'm not writing stories set in like, early 19th century, like New England either, right? Like I decided to write a multi-level giant megapolis. Yeah. it's not really your standard like Lovecraftian setting. And so like there's that aspect as well. Probably the closest I got was Old Broken Road, which is book 2, which is really a road story where characters are kind of traveling, but even that is more of like a Western vibe than it does kind of like your traditional like Lovecraftian, like, small town on the New England coast kind of thing, bunch of Norwegians cussing at each other. Like it's not there.
Let's head back to our cocktail now. And why don't we dive into taste and smell, do a little bit of sampling. When you go about drinking this beverage, what is it you get from it? What are you seeing and smelling and tasting?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, but I should have said this early on. This cocktail kicks you in the mouth. Yes. This is a strong cocktail. There's nothing in this to water it down. Like you might stir it with ice. Like that's what you're supposed to do, is just prepare it with a little, like put it in some ice and drain it. But like we're talking mezcal, chartreuse, and vermouth, and all those things are pretty strong. So it's like, this is not a cocktail that you're going to drink many of. You're going to have like one or two, and that's it, because otherwise you're not going to be feeling great. It tastes amazing. So it's the sprig of rosemary, which is the garnish, is really more of like the smell. Like it doesn't really influence. I think there's so much more going on within the body of the cocktail that it's really just that kind of bringing it up and smelling it. So like you'll smell the rosemary, but then it's quickly the chartreuse and the vermouth are so like, there's all those just like cavalcade of botanicals. Yes. Which makes there's a bunch of like expensive words to describe what is a lot of like floral and herbal flavors that really start to come in. And then the mezcal actually adds really just kind of that like mellow smokiness at the end, which is, I think, the part that is really nice. Like this is not a thing that you like, it's a sipper, but it's also, it's like a sipper a lot of times when people call things sippers, right? Like you and I are both big Scotch fans.
Yes.
And some of our favorite Scotches are pretty harsh for most people. Like we like really smoky, peaty Scotches. And when you sip those, you're sipping them because you take a big drink of that and try to swallow it. It's going to, you're going to cough. And
yes.
Nobody wants to
burn,
cough right
so
now.
much burn.
Yeah, exactly. Where this is doesn't have that. Like you can take a drink of this and it's like super smooth on the back end. And I think a lot
of that is the Chartreuse. It's for as just basically apothecary as Chartreuse is. It's also got a really nice sweetness and almost syrupiness to it. Like it's not thick by any means, but I for the longest time I avoided Chartreuse because I'm not a huge anise fan, and I just assumed it was gonna have a bunch of anise flavor. But... And then I tried it and I was like, I have just ruined years of my life by not drinking this stuff. It's amazing, and so I try to use it a lot now.
Well, you're the one who introduced me to Chartreuse. I really didn't have it. Like it's not I tend to be pretty basic when it comes to cocktails of choice, like martinis or scotch, or really straightforward. And you've been more of the mixologist in our friendship, so it's like when we started talking about this, I was like, I've never really had that, and it's phenomenal. Like it pairs so well, especially with clear liquors. So gin, mezcal. That's like probably, I don't drink vodka, but maybe vodka too. I mean, you're going to just taste the Chartreuse. It's going to end whatever. But
it's one of those bottles that's like just expensive enough that you see it in the liquor store and you're like, nah, I'm not going to spring for it. And it's really worth it. If
no, it absolutely is. It's, I think here in the States, I think I paid $100 for a bottle.
Oof.
And yeah, it's not cheap here right now.
That's painful. Over here on the continent, it's a little bit cheaper than that. But that's rough. That hurts my heart.
Well, I mean, they don't have to ship it.
That's true,
right? Like it's much easier to ship it there. It's also kind of in demand right now, apparently. So that might have also driven up the cost. Like I think it got written up in some fancy cocktail, whatever. So. It is
this year's hot ingredient.
Keep in mind, I'm also Seattle prices, which is going to be way more expensive than other parts of the country. So, take 20% off that. It's probably closer to like $60 to $80 in the rest of the country, and probably cheaper than that in California. But you're not using a ton of it. Like it's only one part Chartreuse, so it's like a bottle will last you a long time. Unless you're having like this every single night, I suppose. Like you don't need very much of it to really get that kind of that botanical herbalness that kind of comes through it. It's great. It makes the cocktail. I mean, it is the key ingredient. And then everything else just kind of helps balance all that out.
So one thing I want to come back to before we move on to the more nuts and bolts technical side of adapting a mythos is, earlier you mentioned a lot of other influences that you had in the cosmic horror realm. But for people who aren't quite as versed in that world, are there certain stories or characters or creatures that would stand out from some of those other authors' work that people might recognize?
Hastur's probably going to be the big one. Hastur's a really interesting concept. I'm going to go off on a tangent here.
Okay, feel free.
Because there's really been, they call them stages. Various people have gone and done deep dives into Lovecraft's work and his friends and all these sort of things. And so there's kind of stage one, which was Lovecraft, Clark Ashton Smith, Robert Howard, who I think is somebody that everybody recognizes. He wrote Conan, Robert Bloch, Frank Belknap Long, Harry Nutter, all these people that were they were sending letters to each other. They were stealing each other's ideas. They were writing each other into their stories.
That's interesting because that has a very strong fan fiction vibe.
Oh, absolutely.
The community aspect of it.
Yeah. And I remember I was on a convention years ago, and it was me and a bunch of people on a panel, and somebody was the question was do you think Lovecraft, what would you think Lovecraft would think of what has happened to his work? And somebody's I think he'd hate it. And I'm like, no, he wouldn't. All they did was write and borrow, and they were all excited about writing horror and that was like supernatural fiction. Like that's what they wanted to write. And they were always thrilled when other people were like sending them letters and being inspired by one another. So like that was very common, I think, there. And there is a fan fiction vibe. Like Howard stuff, like you don't see the influence necessarily right away with Conan, I think, but also most of us are more familiar with Conan because of Arnold Schwarzenegger's incredible movies.
Absolutely.
Going to say I love the Conan movies. They're all good. Even the bad ones are good. They're fun.
Yeah.
And so, but like, there's definitely like Yig and all these characters are coming from like the cosmic horror Lovecraft vibe. Like that, when you start to like, if you go back and read some of the Conan stories, you'll absolutely pick up on like kind of it's not just swords and sorcery. You're like, oh, holy crap, look at all this like cosmic horror that's mixed in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So there's that as well. So like, as far as like, so back to other things that people recognize. So Hastur is a really interesting one because it's very loosely connected to Lovecraft, but it's mostly coming from Robert Chambers because Hastur is a location mentioned in The King in Yellow, but Hastur is also being borrowed by Chambers from a writer named Ambrose Bierce, who wrote a book called, I'm probably saying the name wrong, it's called like Haida the Shepherd or Haida the Shepherd. And I've read it once and it was like whatever, and like Hastur in that was like this kind of benign god of shepherds, and Chambers borrowed it as like a location sort of name. Sort of like you can never really tell with The King in Yellow because it's all just kind of very nebulous. But then Lovecraft picks it up too because Lovecraft had read Bierce and Lovecraft had read Chambers, and he mentions it in like The Whisper in the Darkness, and so and which also references the yellow sign, which is coming from Chambers as well. So Lovecraft is just borrowing these random things for, the story he's writing, Whisper in the Darkness. So it started to connect kind of The King in Yellow to the Lovecraftian universe as it stands. Like there's a religion within my stories called Hasturians, which is a reference to Hastur. They worship Hastur, who they refer to as the Cold Shepherd, which is a reference to Ambrose Bierce. So like there's all these like kind of connections there. Arthur Macken's Great God Pan I mentioned. Pan kind of shows up in the first book, so there's a little bit of that as well. I didn't borrow directly from it, so I was talking about the stages. Second stage is kind of August Derleth and some of the people who wrote kind of in that era, which kind of was, I want to say middle century, middle 19th century, something like that. And Derleth really started to do this like good versus evil elemental monsters, like kaiju kind of thing, which works well for the Lovecraft universe. I mean, Cthulhu, the giant monster that rises out of the ocean, like that's how is that not Godzilla, right? So, there is that good versus evil aspect, but nothing directly that kind of comes from that kind of second stage. Like most of my reference stuff is going to come from kind of that first stage, Lovecraft in a circle. Clark Ashton Smith, I believe, is Thasuga, who shows up in my third book. He, I believe, was the creator initially of him, and he then shows up in Lovecraft stuff as well. So like it's all connected on some level. And so like there's aspects as well. So it's not like it's hard to just be like it's this, because this is also being influenced by that, which is being pulled from this, which is kind of, as you said, it's like this weird fan fiction-y sort of vibe that kind of happened.
All right, so let's dive into some of the nuts and bolts writing craft side of this. My first question there would be, what are some of the specific challenges you faced when trying to adapt a mythos, somebody else's world, to your own?
Oftentimes, you want to approach something like that. I think initially I wanted to approach it with like this like air of gravitas and respect, and I've kind of gotten away from that a little bit, because your work is your work, and you're going to be inspired the way you're inspired, and don't necessarily hold sacred cows when it comes to this stuff. Like it's not a thing. I think the challenges come when you're trying to force someone else's ideas into your whatever your story is, whatever your plot line is, or whatever your character is. And if it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And I think a lot of times when someone's like really inspired is when they're trying to, or challenges when they're really trying to stick within, whatever box that they're adapting. And because I'm not really doing that anymore, or I really haven't been since the beginning, it's allowed me to just kind of go in directions where when I find that I'm hitting walls, it's usually me being like, I've got to mention this because then the Lovecraft fanatics are going to understand what I'm talking about. And I'm like, and I usually end up having to step back and just pull that out of the story because usually I'm trying to adapt something that doesn't really work for my world. I'd imagine it's probably more of a challenge for somebody that's like writing Star Wars fiction right now. Because it's
what a huge world that is. Jeez.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And like it has rules and it has like all these, like you're not like I get to make all that stuff up. I've always had a bit of a trouble working in someone else's creation, mainly because I want to just go somewhere else. I want to be like, scrap all that. And now Jedi can fly, and this is what we're doing now. And like, and you can't do that within a rigid mythology, regardless of what that mythology is. And I think trying to, you're either going to write in that rigid mythology or you're going to take it and make it your own and kind of bite the hand that feeds you. It just comes naturally. I think there's also just that aspect too, because you're going to be biting the hand that feeds you. There's going to be certain people that just hate whatever you're doing because it's not true to whatever,
the originalists and the Puritans.
And let me tell you, the cosmic horror fandom, mostly Lovecraft fandom, Lovecraft in particular, because like you don't see guys going around calling themselves Clark Ashton Smithies or whatever. Lovecraft fans kind of fall into multiple categories, but the biggest schism would be purists and people like me, and I'm not a purist. I think the mythos is broad enough that, if anything, I think let people take it and adapt it and do something else. N.K. Jemisin just did a book that is heavily influenced by Lovecraft, written as a response to Lovecraft. This is The City We Became, which is part of her, I think, Great Cities trilogy. And very different. And I thought it was very fresh. Like it was a fresh take on kind of that mythos aspect. Mm-hmm. And then I read a book last year by an author named Haley Piper, and they wrote a little bit more traditional on some level, kind of like Lovecraftian story, but then it had this like very interesting American twist to it, which I think, again, it's not traditional. Like there's people that are going to write traditional Lovecraftian fiction about stuffy New Englanders writing letters to one another about the horrors they witnessed. And there's going to be people that want to read that. I want something different. I want something fresh. I want new. I want weird. I want you to dip into all these things that aren't that kind of true sort of thing. So that's kind of been, I think, a driver for me in my work.
So speaking of things that are driving you in your work, are there any specific, I don't necessarily want to say rules, but have there been any consistent maybe guiding principles that you've stuck with book to book to book through this series that is kind of specifically in regard to the mythos and how you incorporate it and use it?
Not necessarily in regard to the mythos, but I do have one rule that I really like. And this is a rule that you and I have talked about for years now. Mike Carey, who wrote a bunch of things that I love, he wrote what I would regard as the greatest run on the Hellblazer comic series for DC's Vertigo. He wrote the Lucifer comic series. He wrote the Felix Castor urban fantasy novels, which are great. He's probably most well known for his Girl with All the Gifts, which is a kind of like a weird mushroom zombie book, like Cordyceps kind of thing. So I remember hearing an interview with him about, in particular, his Felix Castor series, and he had this concept, and I want to, and I'm paraphrasing. This isn't direct. I think it was like the one big idea. And the one big idea is always kind of a thing that I've tried to apply to my work. And the one big idea is, if you're going to write fiction, give your audience one thing that they just have to accept as, this is a thing that is, you know, outside of the norm. This is the one hurdle you have to get over. And then that kind of influences everything. So for me, that's essentially, the elder gods exist. They showed up, they wrecked shop, and they changed everything. Everything comes from that one idea.
Yeah.
And so as long as it all kind of can connect back to that, I feel like you get a really good, solid, holistic world. Like in Carrie's work, it was ghosts. So ghosts are real, and ghosts come back, and ghosts, like if a ghost possesses the body of a dog and it's a human ghost, it tries to reshape the body into a human shape, and now you have werewolves, which is a great idea. Like,
oh, crazy. Okay.
Yeah, and so like his whole world is based off the idea that ghosts come back and can possess things, and like that's the Felix Castor novels, and it follows basically a guy that uses music to basically get rid of ghosts. Like it's a cool series. But I think, you know, that one big idea thing has kind of always applied to my work. So it's like, okay, the big idea is essentially that these elder gods, for lack of a better term in my world, that I call them firsts, or founders. They exist. They have come before. They've wrecked shop. They've changed everything fundamentally. They're possibly coming again. And that's kind of the driver for everything. And then the main character, Waldo Bell, is kind of stuck in the middle of all that. So that's the rule, I suppose, that I applied to the work. What rules did you have when writing radio, right? Because like you have this, like we've talked about the one big idea, and I know that came into play when we were talking about kind of the foundation of radio, but like, were there anything else, or was that like we'll talk about like you're applying that same thing to like radio?
Yeah. I definitely am in the same camp with you. I know a lot of people like fantasy that's just, you know, give me as many things as you want. You want flying elves, you want airplanes that drop blueberries. I want it all, and I want it now. And that's, I totally get that desire. But for me, I can't settle in to a world when it's letting loose like that. That just doesn't work for me. And for radio, I want to say it was either 3 or 4 basic asks. I like to keep it to a handful or less. And it's basically that gods are actually people who can control minds. I need you to just be on board with that. The second thing is that our consciousness comes to us like a signal from somewhere. It's not intrinsic to our brains. It's something that you tune into. And so the way that mind control and reading minds works is that normies like you and me only can tune into our own signal. That's all we get. Kind of intermediate Madame Esmeraldas and the great Mindinis of the world, they can also tune into other people's consciousness. They just can't do anything about it. They're just eavesdroppers. Yeah. And then the last group, the gods, they can not only tune into other people's consciousness, but they can actually get into their head and direct them, and leave directions and make them do things, make them see things. And the third one is that these gods basically are semi-immortal. They can send their consciousness into a new body. So they can be killed, but they basically have body hopped for thousands of years.
Sure.
And so those are the items I need you to buy. And then everything else in the book is completely real world. I mean, it's
basically it's historical fiction.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Historical fiction with like this fantastical bent, and I think you did a really good job with that. Like it definitely has. It feels very real. Like Paris feels alive in ways that like I don't think a lot. Like you read a ton of books written in Paris, and it doesn't seem like those people have actually lived in Paris.
living
or
in
radio.
Paris really is a different experience to just hearing about it or going to visit even.
Right. Yeah. Like you lived in Paris for a couple years and were very much soaked in the space. Like I want to even say, like, I think your neighborhood was a neighborhood in radio, right? Like, wasn't that a part of it?
Yeah. Like we lived, where I lived in Paris was 2.5 blocks from the Moulin Rouge. So it's
there you go.
It's party town, sex town. Like,
yeah, exactly.
It's kind of, it's nicer now, but at that point in time, it was kind of where the rich people went to slum it and where everyone else went to just have a good time.
Yeah, it was the seedy get drunk district.
Yeah. And I always think of Paris as a city that is, it's kind of beautiful from the knees up. And that's kind of the view everyone gives themselves is it truly is a gorgeous city, but the streets are filthy. And like, it's not an easy place to live. It's an amazing place to visit, not necessarily an easy place to live. And it's basically like living in adult Disneyland. And you can imagine how irritated people would be if they were stuck. Yeah. It is like, so you have a lot of grumpy locals and you have, expats like me who are just trying to take it all in. And I cherish those years I lived there, but they definitely weren't the easiest living years of my life. So I really wanted to show, I feel like Paris also gets a really unfair shake when it comes to how it's depicted, because it's so much more dynamic and so much more rich when you look at it from some of its other angles. It has so many facets, and it's got that seedy, dark, gritty underbelly like New York or Chicago or a lot of these
like city of romance and light.
Yeah, like London. Every historical book about London is nothing but coal ash and just soot.
That's not London. Yeah, that's just like part of London.
Exactly, but London gets that. It has the Ripper. It has. It can show both sides of itself, the gleaming and the dirty. And Paris is almost always like, look at the beautiful tower and let's kiss and have some coffee. And that's totally valid and totally great and totally true. But there's also the people on every street corner scamming you and the drugs and the booze and the parties. And it's such a vibrant city. I feel like leaving half of it out is just unfair.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I write city.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think I love the idea of the city just as a concept, not even necessarily a particular city, but just city in general and people in general, and how a city requires people to give themselves to it a little bit. You have to be willing. You have to be willing. There's a level. You're not going to come to you can't enjoy a city if you're coming to it from a selfish angle. Like truly enjoy it. Like you can visit a city and be like, I'm taking everything in, give it all to me. But I think to live in a city requires you to give of yourself to whatever that city or town that you live in, and it's going to take something from you. And I think that plays into a lot of what I'm writing. Like a lot of what I write whenever I'm writing Lovat, which is the main city in my stories. Whenever I'm writing those sort of scenes, like I'm thinking about that sort of aspect that like to you kind of have to give of yourself a little bit. Like you have to feel empathy and see those dirty corners, and you may not like them. You may not want them to be there. You may want to work to try to remove those things. Like those things are all valid choices, but you still have to acknowledge they exist, and you have to be willing to engage in a way that I think a tourist doesn't engage. So like a tourist avoids, don't go down that street, don't go down that alley, don't go, over here, don't walk out at night. Like that's the sort of thing the tourists avoid, right?
Yeah.
And I think when you live in a place, like you're talking about like street hustlers, which I know Paris has a ton of them, but so does Amsterdam, and so does, Edinburgh, and all these other big cities that I've gone to, Melbourne, like all these places have those same things. And I think as a visitor, it's easy to just kind of walk around that sort of thing. But when you live there, you kind of have to acknowledge that it's there and that it exists and that it's like a part of the vibrancy of a city, even if it's not necessarily the shining beacon that we all like to look at. So like I think that truth can come out when you're working with city as a both setting and character, which for you Paris is a character in radio, and Lovat is a character in the Bell Forging cycle. Like these are large cities one is real, one is fake, but like they become a character and a part of those stories. And I think that's
absolutely
a good, I think location itself often gets just shouldered aside, and now we're talking craft. It's just location.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
And I think location should I personally seem to prefer it when location becomes character as well. So like it is a living, vibrant thing that is influencing the same way, a conversation would a character. It also influences, a character just in their interaction in their everyday life. And so like that's a big, I guess that's another rule, right? Like if you're gonna write a location, write it strong enough that it feels like a character in the book.
All right, coming back to this drink one last time here. Let's talk about mood. We've talked about setting, so let's talk about mood setting. This drink, when would you drink it? What would you pair it with? What's the right vibe to have this cocktail in your hand?
Definitely for me, I would say night. I think night is, it's because of our time difference. It's early for me. I know it's evening for you.
Yeah, I get to have a nice evening cocktail.
Yeah, it's definitely, I feel like an evening cocktail. I would like it like as something so like we had it, I was doing a reading of a Chambers-esque story. So it's a story I wrote that's kind of loosely connected to The King in Yellow. So like, which is where the name comes from. Pallid Mask is a reference again to The King in Yellow. So a lot of chamber stuff going on here. So maybe musty books and like evening and like sitting at home and like I'm gonna read a story from this book and relax and pet my dog or cat and like that's kind of the vibe I would give to it. The interesting thing about it is I feel like it's more because of all the like floral and botanical aspects to it. Like it kind of plays against that, right? Like you'd go with like something like you would assume that you'd be like, well, you want to do like a really musky scotch, and I think this kind of works kind of against type in that way. So like it's still a very much an evening drink, but I think it's an evening drink that kind of plays a little bit against kind of the standard evening drink. So that's
Yeah, it doesn't have that like kind of heavy, robust nature of like a Manhattan or something like that you would typically think of in the dark, smoky bar.
Right. Yeah. I actually think it's a drink that's really good to also share with friends which we can do again after this pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Eventually I'll see you in person again.
Yes.
and I could see
we two rare beasts, we are being extrovert fantasy writers. We definitely are hurting during this separation.
Yeah, exactly. Someday we'll be able to we'll be able to get together again. I could actually see this being a really good kind of like group, like four people hanging out, like sitting around having a conversation, even playing games or what have you, like that sort of vibe too. Like it's definitely, it's not a drink you're going to drink fast. And I think, you can't, and you will feel it because it's strong. But
I want to watch if you do. That's the rule. I want to watch it if you do.
Exactly. Send us a video. If you try the Pallid Mask and drink it quickly, please send Jim and I a video.
Yes, absolutely. I will invent swag for this podcast to send to you.
Perfect. There you go. But like, it's one of those things you can have over an hour. We've been having a conversation for a while now. And it's also the one thing that's really interesting about this, which sorry.
No, go for it.
Some cocktails aren't good when they warm up. Like after you've
had
this one is good. It remains solid. Like it doesn't, like obviously cold is how you want to serve it and you want to sip it while it's cold. But like I've noticed as we've been talking, I'm like it clearly gets warm just like any cocktail does. And this doesn't get disgusting. It just stays great. So that's a benefit.
You're right. It's only a temperature change. The flavor doesn't alter itself like some drinks do. Like a warm Manhattan's rough. I love Manhattans. They're one of my favorite drinks, but a room temperature Manhattan is not pleasant.
No, you don't want that. Or like I'm a big martini fan. martinis need to be ice cold.
Yes, yeah.
Like a warm martini is not, because then you're just drinking warm gin. If you're drinking a proper martini.
Basically, unseen cough medicine at that point.
Yeah. You want your martini as cold as ice. And this is something, and maybe it's just a benefit of the blend or whatever. Like, it doesn't seem to be affected by the temperature. So it's good cold or, after 45 minutes at room temperature. So, yeah.
Well, all right, Mr. K.M.Alexander, it is last call here at the Indie Pub. Can you give an indie published book or 2 or 3 that you want more people to check out?
Well, you should check out Radio. That's first.
Thank you.
No, joke aside, it's a fantastic book. So everybody should go check that out. I'm going to kind of cheat a little bit. Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft was an indie published book. I think Orbit picked it up and it's been republished since then.
That's fair game.
Fantastic. Really enjoyed it. Really unique world. I'm currently reading Devin Madsen's reread The Storm, also an indie published book that got picked up by Orbit again. Yes. She's a great writer. I would liken it to it's grimdark, so heavy content warning on this stuff. But I would compare it to George R. R. Martin. I'm about halfway through it right now, and I'm like, this is fantastic. I'm really liking it. I'm also going to recommend a sci-fi called Rich Man's War by a writer I know named Elliot Kay. This is also cheating, but backwards. So I think the first book was published by Amazon with one of their pubs, and then he's taken it indie. So it's like a series that has gone indie. Elliot himself is an indie author and great guy, and his books are a lot of fun. It's about basically space. A space navy and student debt. So
there you go. That's an interesting combo.
Yeah, it's great. Student debt, space navy, and war sucks. So I do recommend it. It's a fun series. The first book is Rich Man's War, so I would recommend that as well.
Okay,
so I recommended 4.
That's fine. Same question, but for any other media, indie or not, just things you think are great that people need to check out.
I'm going to mention 2 other authors.
Okay.
Andy Davidson is a phenomenal horror writer. I could mention a lot of authors, honestly. Like I made a joke the other day that like you get a bunch of horror writers together and all they do is talk about other horror writers' books. Like they don't talk about their own books. They're like, have you read this one? What about this one? What about this one? So Andy Davidson's work, I've only read In the Valley of the Sun. He has a new one out called The Boatman's Daughter, which has gotten great reviews. He's a phenomenal writer. He's very lyrical in his writing, but he's not heavy. Really, like, fantastic. The other author I'd recommend is John Horner Jacobs. He particularly writes cosmic horror, so connected to the stuff I write. So if you like my work, you'd like his work, I think. His book, The Lush and Seething Hell, is phenomenal. It's 2 stories in one book. Both of them are great. He's one of those people that's kind of taking cosmic horror in a completely different direction, and it's fantastic. So those are 2 other bits of media I would recommend. Third Day on HBO is a really good miniseries that's kind of it's horror, but it's also not. It's like Shutter Island meets Lost meets what's the Nick Cage movie with the bees?
Wicker Man?
Wicker Man, but not like the Wicker Man, like not the goofy parts of Wicker Man, but just like the story of Wicker Man, like a weird island people who live on, like that aspect of it. So gotcha, Wicker Man, Lost, Shutter Island, but it has like Jude Law in it, and like it's really good. It's
any student debt?
There's debt involved, but no student debt that I know of. I'm trying to remember now. Maybe student everything on some level. That's a big motivator for a lot of people these days. So that would be something I'd recommend as well. That's on HBO. Let's see. Also the comic book Gideon Falls. And I cannot remember the writer's name right now or the illustrator, and I apologize. But it is a fantastic kind of psychological horror comic that feels very much like kind of the best days of Vertigo. And if you've ever been a comic book reader and you know what Vertigo is, you'll know what I'm talking about. But it is super good, and I've really been enjoying it. I want to say it's probably 24, 20. I think it's like a 24 books at this point. I buy trades, so I'm like a trade buyer. So I'm like, each book is like 4, and I'm like like 6 or 7 now. It's like trying to do the math. I'm like, oh, maybe it's this much. So it's still ongoing, but I've been really enjoying that as well. So there's some other media that is books and things beyond books. So.
All right, finally, tell our listeners what you have going on right now and where they can find you and your work.
Well, you can find me at KMAlexander.com. It is my blog and basically everything. Lots of stuff there. I post stuff about my books. I post stuff about maps. I post stuff about just random things. I am currently in the process of releasing a new book. Book 4 in the Bell Forging cycle comes out on March 30th. It is Gleam Upon the Waves, and it will continue the story of Waldo Bell and the crew of the Bell Caravans as they kind of take a job and things go awry, as they always seem to go for the poor man. So Gleam Upon the Waves comes out March 30th, and book 4 continues. It's the longest book in the series, and I think people will enjoy it.
Thanks everyone for tuning in to the Indie Pub. If you like what you hear, consider giving us a like and subscribe so you won't miss any of our indie investigations or boozy banter. I've been your host, Jay Rushing, and we'll see you back in the pub next time.